Hello everyone, my name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience, and today I want to talk about what seems like a pretty unlikely relationship between diet and disease. Specifically, I want to talk about some new evidence that there may be some interesting interaction between one of my favorite herbs on the planet and one of the most common brain-related diseases on the planet, Alzheimer's disease. So one of my favorite plants and flavors in the world is basil. And you can see some of my basil right here. It's easily one of the most recognizable flavors and herbs out there. I use it on almost everything. Making a sandwich, toss some basil on there. Making a soup of any kind, cut up some basil and toss it in at the end. I try to always have some basil growing, even in my small apartment with 0 yard space. It's one of those things that I think can make, even a pretty bad meal taste better than bad. It's also an incredibly diverse group of herbs, so I've seen estimates that there are anywhere between 50 to 150 varieties of basil. I had to abandon the Thai and purple basil that I was growing when we moved from our last apartment to this one, but it's always been pretty amazing to me how much variety in flavor there is within just this one group of plants. And so, most people have probably largely just eaten sweet basil or Genovese basil, like that one, which is, the sort of standard basil that you'll find in grocery stores, at least in the United States. For me, at least, that's the sort of standard basil flavor. And it's, reliably delicious and perfect. And it's what, I'm growing right now because the grocery store didn't have anything other than those, like, basil plants with their roots in the water. And so I got this one about 2 months ago, and we've been munching on it ever since. But if you've ever had pho, you've very likely had some Thai basil delivered along with it, right, along with the soup. I love Thai basil. A little spicier, definitely has a bit more of that anise, licorice-y kind of flavor, more so than sweet basil. And there are so many others, right? The purple basil that I was growing for a while in my aero garden was absolutely delicious and beautiful. And even more anisey than Thai basil. And then there's lemon basil, which, has like a legit citrusy smell and taste. So good. So anyways, this one category of herbs produces, an almost like an absolutely prodigious portfolio of flavors. And all of that variety and flavor corresponds to the presence of specific molecules, right? And the ratios of which molecules are present in the plant will determine the flavors of the given basil. So, estragol, limonene, eugenol, linalool, eucalyptol, right? There's just like a whole ton of aromatic molecules that sort of tickle, specific combinations of receptors in our olfactory system. And depending upon, which specific combination of receptors are being tickled, which constellation of receptors, we perceive different flavors present in the different kinds of basil. Okay, so, I don't have a PhD in culinary arts or horticulture or whatever, so, why am I going on and on about, how wonderful basil is? Well, a study was published in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience a few days ago. And so this is a group from all over the place. Wake Forest in North Carolina, PES University in Bangalore, India, University of South Florida, and the National Institutes of Animal Biotechnology in Hyderabad, India. Pretty cool. And so this article title is probably, at least a little bit inscrutable to people who aren't, neuroscience nerds. We have microbiota, we have free fatty acid receptor, amyloid beta, neurotoxicity, proteolysis, senescence, right? All in the same title. Quite a mouthful of buzzwords. So let's just translate, at least some of this jargon. What this title is saying is that the activation of this particular type of receptor reduces the negative effects of one of the things that we know is associated with a certain disease. Right? One of the most common diseases in the world, Alzheimer's disease. And so, I chatted about Alzheimer's and dementia almost exactly a month ago, discussing, some of the progress that's been made in using artificial intelligence and machine learning to recognize when someone's developing Alzheimer's, far earlier than we currently can by deploying this artificial intelligence to assess brain scans, right? Enabling us to pick up on some of the super subtle signs that someone might be starting to develop the condition. And so I have a link below to that video in case anybody's interested in checking it out. It's a pretty cool story. And so, but to briefly recognize how gigantic of a concern Alzheimer's disease is, Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia. And dementia is an umbrella category that describes just the progressive loss of a whole variety of brain-related capabilities. Memory, of course, is the sort of classic component that of our consciousness that deteriorates in dementia. But everything from mood to social interaction to personality all begin to radically change and decline as the brain suffers the consequences of the progression of those diseases. And so, there's a bunch of different types of dementia, right? Frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, which is, by the way, what Robin Williams had, and vascular dementia. There's a whole ton. And by the way, it's very common for people to suffer multiple types of dementia simultaneously. So it's not like you must either have Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia, right? People often have signs of more than one cause. And so there are estimates that someone in the world develops dementia every 3 seconds. And so, as you can see here, right, the rates at which dementia is being diagnosed is predicted to escalate worldwide moving forward. And this is particularly going to be the case in low and middle income countries, though rates are expected to gradually rise in higher income countries as well, although that story is a little bit complicated, and we'll get to that towards the end. And so in the United States, Alzheimer's disease is already one of the leading causes of fatalities, just under strokes, and just above diabetes. And so, and by the way, the relative cause of fatalities worldwide, by Alzheimer's disease and dementia look pretty similar to what we see in the United States. So this is for people over 70 years old. And so, I'm sure precisely 0 people need to be convinced that Alzheimer's and dementia are some of the top causes of human suffering worldwide. And while there's been quite a bit of progress towards understanding the biology of Alzheimer's disease, there really hasn't been any particularly compelling progress in developing new treatments for the condition. And so, there has been some recent controversy regarding a new drug that was just FDA approved called aducanumab or Aduhelm, which is a whole story that I'll probably talk about in maybe the near future. But, the short story is that there's this drug that was approved by the FDA for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, despite the protestations of subject matter experts, scientists, physicians who treat dementia, Alzheimer's and dementia, and some of the largest medical institutions in the country and the world, including Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the top biomedical institutions in the world. They announced that they will not be using the medication due to the dearth of evidence supporting its efficacy. Kind of controversial, but yeah. So aducanumab is just the most recent innovation in the world for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, and tons of scientists and physicians have publicly announced that they not only wouldn't endorse its use as a treatment for the disease, but they don't think it should have been approved to begin with. And so that's the sort of state of affairs when it comes to treatments for Alzheimer's disease, right, and dementia. Despite truly massive progress in understanding the basic neurobiology underlying the condition, there just aren't all that many new treatments, and certainly nothing approximating a cure. And so we've now explored 2 topics that are intuitively pretty unrelated: Basil and Alzheimer's disease. Both are interesting, of course, in their own ways, but this paper connects some otherwise unconnected dots. Okay, so let's start at the start. All of us, every one of us, is basically a coral reef. Okay, obviously not literally coral reefs, but just like this coral reef right here, we are the host of a huge repertoire of microbes, teeny tiny little organisms like bacteria and fungi that inhabit various parts of our body, right? Everything from our mouths, our eyes, our armpits, and, most relevantly, our gut. And all of us have slightly different collections of those microbes. And so, we as Homo sapiens literally evolved alongside these microbial species. They all depend on us, and we depend on some of them. But when we look at which specific microbes inhabit all of us, there's quite a bit of variability, right? We don't all have the same types of microbes that inhabit our bodies. And so depending upon where you live, who your parents are, particularly your mother, what you eat, what kind of sex-related hormones are swimming through your blood, what kinds of infections you've had and what kinds of medications you've had to take as a result, and what you do day to day, right, your lifestyle. You'll have a unique distribution of these microbes. And even more importantly, some of those microbes are capable of influencing our bodies in various ways. And so I've linked to an article in the outlet called The Conversation, from which this picture is derived. In any case, in case anyone's interested in checking it out, it's about the microbiome more broadly, not just in the context of brain health or dementia. This is, focusing specifically on some of the favorable interactions of these microbes with various parts of our bodies, right? So here are the influencing factors that determine what the microbiome, what composes each of our microbiomes, and then those are some of the effects, right, that specific microbes can have. But when it comes to the gut, right, which is the largest reservoir of these microbes that inhabit our body, right? When it comes to the gut, these microbes can take some of the molecules from what we eat, from our diet, convert those molecules into new molecules, and those new molecules can interact with our bodies in unique ways. And so in some cases, right, the presence of certain microbes can result in a predisposition to various diseases and disorders. So everything from obesity, psoriasis, irritable bowel syndrome or irritable bowel disease, to cardiovascular disease and colon cancer, right? They've all been associated with high levels of specific microbes. And there's even evidence that the presence of certain microbes is associated with various psychiatric conditions, and that's something I've talked about in the past as well. I've linked to one of my past discussions of the topic of the relationship between the microbiome and brain-related diseases and disorders, or the psychobiome, below if you want to check it out. So, while a lot of the discussion associated with the microbiome tends to focus on the negative effects, negative effects of certain microbes, there are also beneficial relationships that we can have with certain microbes. And today's paper focuses on, that kind of a relationship. Specifically, certain microbes generate what are called short-chain fatty acids, okay, which have been associated with reductions of Alzheimer's associated signs within the brain. So short-chain fatty acids are exactly what they sound like, right? They're just fats that happen to have short chains. I know that might sound fairly unintelligible, right? What do you mean by chains? When I say chain, what I mean is the squiggly connection of carbon atoms that are connected in a series, dangling off of a part of the molecule that makes it an acid, okay? And so, you see these zigzag lines like right here, sticking off of the side of each one of these molecules. Those are the chains. And so each corner, each little apex along those zigzags is a carbon atom, okay? And so when it comes to a short chain fatty acid, those zigzags are short, like shorter than the ones that you're seeing here, right? These are medium chain fatty acids. And so there's a little receptor that works in a way that's, you can think of it similarly to, dopamine or serotonin receptor, but it's in a whole variety of different parts of the body. And importantly, this group found that neurons also produce this receptor. And so in other words, the brain might also be sensitive to the effects of these, shorter little fatty acids. Okay, so what is this receptor? The free fatty acid receptor 2, or FFAR2. It's basically like a sensor for specific types of molecules that are often produced by, the little microbes that inhabit our gut, right? And it turns out that those short-chain fatty acids, which, once again, are produced by some of the beneficial microbes that can inhabit our gut, not necessarily, but they can, those short-chain fatty acids bind that receptor, that like sensor receptor. And so it also turns out that when it comes to the microbiome and the gut of someone who has Alzheimer's disease, they tend to have rather low levels of those short-chain fatty acids. Okay, so that's sort of where this group started. They started out by finding that, if they inhibit that receptor, the receptor that those beneficial short-chain fatty acids bind, if they inhibit that receptor, some of the molecular signatures of Alzheimer's disease tend to get worse. Okay, and so for anybody who might be familiar, levels of amyloid beta were higher when that receptor was inhibited in neurons. So, like any neuroscientist or pharmacologist would, they imagine what might happen if they just hit that receptor directly, right? Taking out the microbial middleman, right? So you didn't have to rely on the microbe producing those short chain fatty acids. What if you just stimulate the receptor yourself directly? And so they used a computational system termed in silico screening to get a sense of which molecule out of 144,000 molecules might interact with that receptor. And so they landed on 15 molecules. Okay, 15 out of 144,000. And for whatever reason, they ended up honing in on a particular molecule called fenchel. And that was, among the most potent of those 144,000 molecules, as well as among those 15 molecules that they selected. And so there's like zero reason, for anyone to know what on earth fenchel is or means. And frankly, it's kind of an abusive sound for a word to use as a name for what this molecule is. This is the molecule that gives basil its basily smell and taste. So evidently it's like the basil molecule. Without this molecule, we'd just be munching on like some weirdly bitter or anisey or citrusy leaves, right, in basil. And so this plant, for example, is producing fenchel. And so it turns out that this molecule happens to bind that fatty acid receptor, that receptor that the beneficial short-chain fatty acids that are typically produced by some of the beneficial microbes that inhabit our gut will tend to bind. And so when bound, that receptor may tend to reduce the production of amyloid beta plaques. And so in other words, it seems to be the case that this molecule binds the same receptor that the products of beneficial microbes bind. And when that receptor is bound, the stuff that we think is part of the cause of Alzheimer's disease tends to be produced at lower levels. And so they have evidence to suggest that it seems to amplify one of the systems in our cells that basically clears out problematic proteins and molecules via the lysosome. And so pretty cool, right? Generally speaking, the garbage disposals or the recycling centers in cells, you have the proteasome and the lysosome. Those are the sort of the main ones. And they do kind of similar things, but they're different parts of the cell, and they tend to target different types of molecules. And so the lysosome is the one that seems to be amplified by this whole pathway to help clear out amyloid beta plaques. Okay, so that's super fun, right? Eat more basil would be the takeaway, right? And frankly, I eat basil, whenever it's even marginally reasonable. Like often even when it's not particularly reasonable. So like, last night my daughter didn't finish a bagel bite. You better believe that I warmed it back up at night, with a little sopressata, salami, and like a silly number of fresh basil leaves. This thing grows like a champion. And I'm basically eating an anti-Alzheimer's bagel, right? Not quite. I mean, I do that, but these data are super preclinical, super preliminary, okay? And, this evidence is based based in nematodes and in mice, okay? So not exactly human biology, but to be clear, like my research was at the same level, working with mice. And so, by no means am I denigrating this research, but I've seen a whole bunch of like headlines that suggest that basil might prevent Alzheimer's. And that's absolutely not where we should be going with these data, at least at this stage. And so, I suspect that, the amount of this molecule that would be necessary to achieve anything like what we're talking about would be so massive that you'd have to like eat a forest of basil to get enough of that molecule. And even then, I'm guessing that this molecule in particular isn't likely the most effective strategy to target this receptor. We could probably make better molecules. And so, in other words, this study is really putting a target on a particular receptor as a potential strategy to minimize the likelihood that something, we think causes Alzheimer's disease will tend to accumulate, right? Amyloid beta plaques. Not that we should all be gobbling up tons of this particular molecule or a whole ton of basil, right? But that said, this is not the first study to connect fenchel, right, that molecule that's present in basil, along with other plants, by the way. Fenchel is in other plants, like, from aster flowers to cannabis. And so I actually have a link to a review that touches on one connection, between fenchel and Alzheimer's, though, through a different mechanism than this study. But interestingly enough, but its link is down below. Anyway, so, I think it is worth at least acknowledging that there's a kind of growing suspicion among some neuroscientists, and that basically that maybe the whole framework of how we understand Alzheimer's disease has been at least somewhat misguided. So there's an article in Stat News that gets into some of this kind of debate, partly inspired by the approval of aducanumab, that Alzheimer's drug that I talked about in the beginning. And it's a great article, but central to their point is two main things. Okay, so first, we don't have any effective drugs to treat Alzheimer's yet. Second, despite that, rates of dementia are actually falling. And so this contradicts the projections that I was talking about in the beginning, right? Where projections of rates of dementia are expected to increase, right? But these scientists acknowledge that actually rates seem to be very slowly, don't get me wrong, but slowly declining. And so that's interesting, despite the fact that we have no effective treatments, let alone cures. And implicit in this argument that we have to rethink how we understand Alzheimer's disease is that maybe we've been overly focused on trying to target amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. There's even a sort of fun kind of like set of nicknames for the scientists who argue that Alzheimer's disease is largely driven by amyloid beta plaques, which are also called beta amyloid. These scientists are informally termed Baptist, beta amyloid plaques, Baptists. And then there's the Taoists, who are, they emphasize the role of neurofibrillary tangles, which are composed of a protein called tau. Taoists, right? Anyway, so this is a whole separate discussion, but there's kind of a growing concern that that's been there for a long time, by the way. At this point, like, people were making this argument even when I was starting graduate school almost a decade ago, and before that too. So but basically, given the failures of the drugs that do effectively reduce amyloid beta plaques and amyloid beta plaques specifically, right? We do have drugs that can do that, but they've failed to improve symptoms. So what else might be accounting for what seems to be falling rates of Alzheimer's disease? Story for another day. It's an interesting topic. But anyway, so Baptists and Taoists aside, where does this leave us? So, we should all definitely eat more basil. That's for sure, obviously. But does this study suggest that eating basil may reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease? Not quite. Really, what this study is indicating is that there may be a relationship between the stimulation of a receptor that's typically bound by short-chain fatty acids and the changes in the brain associated with Alzheimer's disease, right? And what that would correlate, or what that would connect to, are the lifestyle differences between people who are at a greater risk of Alzheimer's disease and those who aren't, right? And, in general, lifestyle factors that are associated with biomedical conditions have improved over the past, many, many years. We just live healthier lives, believe it or not, than, people did decades ago, centuries ago, right? And so it might just be that simple, but this might be a mechanism by which, just one of many mechanisms by which, you cultivate a healthy microbiome, you cultivate some of those microbes that produce those short-chain fatty acids, and just so over the long term, you just have that as a part of your biology, and then so you get this chronic stimulation of that receptor that then helps to clear away amyloid beta plaques, right? That would be the broader interpretation of what this study might indicate. But they also showed if you stimulate that receptor, the receptor that these short-chain fatty acids bind, those molecules that, those beneficial microbes that inhabit our gut produce, right? If you stimulate those receptors, we tend to see lower levels of the same types of things that we know are at least associated with Alzheimer's disease, if not causes it, or if not cause it. And so, in other words, this is a new possible strategy to attack Alzheimer's disease. It's not necessarily suggesting that, eating a whole bunch of basil will prevent Alzheimer's disease, right? But that said, it couldn't hurt. All right, so that's what I have for you today. And if you dig this kind of thing, discussion of brain-related topics, maybe you'll consider subscribing and liking and doing all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Hey, Scott, good to see you in here, man. Basil, the Sherlock Holmesiest of all of the Rathbones. I'm a coral reef. Yes, that certainly explains my irregular shape and inconsistent color. Indeed, yeah. That's exactly the point I was trying to make. That Scott is a coral reef. And so we all have microbiomes, even micro. It's a microbiome. I'm not even gonna entertain that. the clear dad joke. Although I dig it. My father must have had a background in organic chemistry because he was always telling me I have a fatty acid. Wait a minute. Fenchel. Yeah, Fenchel. Started to read over the black text over the houseplant. Nematodes with dementia tend to forget how completely awful they make our lives. And of course, Alzheimer's disease numbers are dropping. Boomers are starting to die off. Right, but the projection was, there's this whole concept of the gray tsunami. Right, and yeah, you're right. I mean, that is a very big age demographic. But then again, the millennial generation is also very big. Gen X is also very big. I'm sorry, not Gen X actually. I mean, they're not. Gen X isn't tiny, but they were smaller than the boomers. But I believe millennials are essentially comparable in size in terms of the generation and population. And then the Zoomers, I think, are also a pretty big group. And so I mean, you're right. Obviously we have Gen X between the boomers and millennials, but yeah, so I mean, the expectation was that, yeah, like the boomers are going to like usher in this sort of era of a significant public health concern of Alzheimer's and dementia, and so on and on we go, right? And so you if you're just keeping at that population level, nothing else is really changing. No new medications, no new treatments. It's just going to continue to be this very significant public health concern. And so, I didn't want to get into that whole debate because, like, not every scientist argues that rates of dementia are declining, right? But some do. And so it is this sort of like paradox of like, why would they be declining if it's not like the population itself has decreased very much? We still have a lot of people who are in that age group that's at the greatest risk of dementia, age-related conditions in general. And so what might account for that? And I sort of touched on it a little bit, but they fundamentally make the argument that it's our lifestyle factors. It's that our nutrition is it's not great, right? There's room for improvement, but it's better than, it was decades ago, centuries ago. And then, a bunch of other things like, people control, probably the single greatest factor that I've heard some of these folks argue is cardiovascular disease, right? Heart disease is like the king of all maladies, right? Despite the wonderful book, The Emperor of All Maladies, which is cancer in that case. But, heart disease is like the top cause of death, right? And we do have medications for heart disease, right? Elevated, hypercholesterolemia. We have statin drugs. We have a bunch of different medications to just reduce irregularities in our cardiovascular system. And they make the argument that by doing that, rather than trying to treat Alzheimer's disease directly, but by controlling these other factors, as well as diabetes, heart disease, all of these things, by treating those, all of those things exacerbate, one's risk for Alzheimer's dementia. And so by treating those things, you're just reducing that. And so you get this indirect beneficial effect on rates of dementia. That's the argument that they make, right? I'm not saying that they're necessarily correct, but I am sympathetic to their argument that we've been hyper-focused on beta amyloid plaques, the Baptists, and Taoists, right? The neurofibrillary tangles, right? Despite being able to clear them out in somebody who's still alive, symptoms don't really improve very much. And so there must be something else going on. Just my luck to be the tiny generation. My diet of nothing but fast food and beers paying for woohoo. Yeah, right. Yeah, it's probably not optimal. All right, that's what I have for you this week. If you dig this kind of conversation, maybe you'll consider subscribing. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Thanks for watching.